His name was Salvatore Gravano. And before he was anything else, before he was an underboss, before he was a killer, before he was the most consequential witness in the history of American organized crime, he was a kid from Bensonhurst who couldn't read. He had dyslexia. The school failed him. The street did not. The following account draws on court records, FBI wiretap transcripts, federal indictment documents, and Peter Maz's biography, Underboss, based on extensive interviews with Gravano himself. Some exchanges have been reconstructed from documented accounts. Names, dates, and locations are a matter of public record. Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, 1945. The neighborhood had rules. They weren't written anywhere. You didn't go to the police. You didn't borrow what you couldn't repay. You didn't disrespect a man in front of his crew. And if someone came to collect, you paid. These weren't the rules of one family or one block. They were the operating system of the entire neighborhood, passed down without ceremony, learned through consequence. Salvatore Gravano was born into this system on March 8, 1945. His parents were Sicilian immigrants. His father ran a small dress factory. They were working class, honest, and entirely disconnected from organized crime. The block was not. By the time Sammy was 13, he had been arrested twice. Not for anything sophisticated. Petty theft. A fight that put another kid in the hospital. The kind of incidents that get a middle-class boy sent to a counselor and a Bensonhurst boy sent to understand that the courts are just another system that can be navigated. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade. He started running with a local street gang called the Rampers. And in the Rampers, Sammy Gravano found the first thing that ever made sense to him. Not violence exactly, something more specific than that. He found that men with reputations didn't get pushed around. And reputation in Bensonhurst was built one confrontation at a time. The men Sammy admired weren't gang members. They were older, quieter. They sat in the same social club every afternoon. They drove cars that didn't match their apparent income. And when they walked down the street, people moved. These were Colombo family associates, lower-level earners who ran numbers, controlled small construction contracts, and handled disputes that the neighborhood didn't want to take to a judge. One of them noticed Sammy, not because he was violent, but because he was loyal, disciplined, and completely without fear. At 17, Sammy Gravano was brought in as an associate. No oath yet, no ceremony, just work. And for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 1964. Sammy Gravano was 19 years old. The order came through a man he trusted. The target was Joe Colucci, a local figure, not particularly important, who had committed the specific kind of offense that the neighborhood settled privately. According to Peter Maz's biography, Underboss, Gravano later described his state of mind before the killing with a clarity that is more chilling than any dramatization. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't conflicted. He understood what was being asked of him, and he understood what it would mean for his future if he delivered. Colucci got into the car expecting a conversation. Sammy was already in the back seat. 2 shots. The body was left in a lot near Canarsie. And Salvatore Gravano was, at 19 years old, a killer who had proven he could be trusted with the most serious work there was. Within a year of the Colucci killing, Gravano made a transition that would define the rest of his life. He left the orbit of the Colombo family and aligned himself with the Gambino family under a capo named Salvatore Orello, known throughout Brooklyn simply as Tato. Tato Orello ran construction rackets. He controlled union locals. He collected tribute from contractors who wanted to work in Brooklyn without problems. He was 60 years old, methodical, and had survived in organized crime longer than most men managed by being careful with his words, and even more careful about who he trusted. He took Gravano under his wing, not as a favor, as an investment. Aurelio told him directly,
"You work for me, you earn. You earn, you rise. You cause problems, I can't protect you. Understand?"
Sammy understood. He always understood the rules. What changed was which rules he was following. The construction industry in New York City in the 1960s and 70s was, in significant part, a mafia-controlled enterprise. This is not a dramatic claim. It is a documented reality confirmed by multiple federal investigations, congressional testimony, and the cooperative statements of dozens of witnesses over 3 decades. The mechanism was straightforward. If you wanted a contract in New York, if you wanted your project to proceed without labor disruptions, without materials disappearing, without inspectors finding sudden problems, you paid. You paid the union locals that the family controlled. You paid the concrete companies they owned. And you paid the men who made the introduction. Gravano became one of those men. He was not flashy about it. He did not drive a Cadillac. He did not wear gold. He showed up, he collected, he reported back, and he kept 30% of everything he brought in. By 1970, he had his own small crew. By 1973, men were asking his permission before they started working. At the top of the family that Gravano was climbing sat Paul Castellano. Big Paul, the boss. Castellano had taken over the Gambino family after Carlo Gambino died in 1976, and he had immediately begun transforming it from a traditional crime family into something that looked, from a certain angle, like a holding company. He ran meetings from his mansion in Tot Hill, Staten Island. He wore suits that cost more than most of his soldiers made in a month. He spoke about business in terms that sounded almost corporate. Castellano had a theory about organized crime. Violence, in his view, was a management failure. It attracted attention, it created enemies, and it was almost always avoidable through the right financial arrangement. He was not wrong. He was also not entirely right, because the men beneath him were not all built for patience and restraint. Some of them were built for something else. 1975. Salvatore Gravano was formally inducted into the Gambino crime family. The ceremony, as described in documented accounts and later confirmed in federal testimony, followed the ritual that had remained largely unchanged since the organization's origins in Sicily. A finger was pricked, blood on a burning card, the oath of omerta. You were born into a family once, and you could leave it at death. You were made into this family once, and the only exits were prison or a hole in the ground. Gravano understood the weight of it. What he could not know, standing in that room in Brooklyn in 1975, was that 30 years later he would sit in a federal courtroom and describe this ceremony, this oath, in precise detail, to a jury, under oath to a different system entirely. The Gambino family in the late 1970s was the largest and most powerful organized crime family in the United States. 5 boroughs of New York, construction, garbage collection, the waterfront, trucking, garment manufacturing, and dozens of ancillary businesses that fed tribute upward through a hierarchy that had remained structurally stable for decades. At the top, the boss. Below him, the underboss and the consigliere. Below them, the capos each commanding a crew. Below the capos, the soldiers. Below the soldiers, the associates. This was not a metaphor. This was an organizational chart. What separated Gravano from other earners in the Gambino family was not his willingness to use violence. Plenty of men were willing. Violence was not rare. What separated him was that he used it precisely. He didn't fight because he was angry. He didn't threaten because he enjoyed it. When Sammy Gravano applied force, physical, financial, or reputational, it was calculated. It solved a specific problem, and it almost always sent a message that solved 3 problems he hadn't yet had to address. Men in the family noticed this. Tato Orello noticed it first. Then the men above Orello began to notice it. Not every killing Gravano ordered was a family directive. In 1982, a man named Frank Fila purchased a nightclub in Brooklyn called the Plaza Suite from Gravano's crew for $1 million. The sale was agreed. The papers were signed. Then Fila began to act as though he owned the neighborhood as well. He arrived at the club with an armed entourage. He made decisions that violated agreements. He disrespected Gravano in front of witnesses. And then, according to trial testimony and documented accounts, he attempted to renegotiate the deal after it had already closed. Gravano authorized his own response. Fila was shot in the head in the parking lot of the Plaza Suite, in front of multiple witnesses. Not one of them went to the police. The message reached every associate and contractor in Brooklyn within 48 hours. Gravano hadn't asked permission from Castellano for the hit. He handled it himself and reported it afterward. Castellano did not reprimand him. He was promoted to capo shortly after. Paul Castellano and John Gotti looked at Salvatore Gravano and saw 2 entirely different men. Castellano saw a productive capo, a man who earned, who controlled his people, and who understood the value of discretion. Gravano was an asset to be deployed, not a confidant, not an inner circle figure, but a reliable instrument of the family's financial interests. Gotti saw something else. He saw a man who was being undervalued. He saw a soldier of genuine ability who was being kept at a distance by a boss who preferred businessmen to warriors. He saw the frustration beneath Gravano's discipline, and he saw the potential of what that frustration could become if it was properly directed. Gotti began cultivating Gravano in the early 1980s, not with grand gestures, with small ones. A conversation after a meeting, a word of recognition that Castellano had never offered, a suggestion, implied rather than stated, that under different leadership, Gravano's role would look very different. Gotti was building towards something. Gravano would not understand exactly what until December of 1985. By 1985, John Gotti had made a decision. Paul Castellano had to go. The reasons were multiple. Castellano had been indicted on federal charges and was facing trial. There was genuine fear among some capos that he would cooperate with the government to save himself. There was also the simpler reality that Gotti, by temperament and ambition, was not built to wait. Killing a sitting boss without commission approval was one of the most serious violations possible in the Mafia's internal code. It had been done before. It had also ended in disaster before. Gotti believed he could manage the aftermath. To do it, he needed men he could trust completely. He went to Gravano. Gravano would later testify to this conversation, or one substantively like it, in federal court.
We have a problem with Paul. It needs to be solved. Are you with me?
I'm with you. What do you need?
What he agreed to that day set in motion the most consequential mob assassination in American history. December 16, 1985. Paul Castellano and his driver, Thomas Bilotti, arrived at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan at approximately 5:40 in the evening. Castellano was scheduled to meet with several capos for dinner. He was expecting a business conversation. What he got was 4 men in trench coats and Russian fur hats, positioned on the sidewalk in a formation that had been planned and rehearsed. As Castellano stepped out of his Lincoln Town car, the shooters moved. 6 shots. Castellano was dead before he hit the pavement. Bilotti was shot and killed on the other side of the car simultaneously. The shooters walked away into the Midtown crowd. The entire operation took less than 30 seconds. 1 block east of Sparks on 2nd Avenue, John Gotti sat in a car and watched. Sammy Gravano was across the street in a second vehicle. They were there as supervisors, as witnesses, and as the men who would take control of what happened next. Gotti watched Castellano fall. He did not get out of the car. He did not approach the scene. He simply observed, satisfied himself that it was done, and drove away. Gravano would later describe this moment in precise detail on the witness stand. The prosecution asked him where he was when Paul Castellano was shot.
I was in a car on 2nd Avenue watching.
The prosecutor asked why he was there.
To make sure it went right, and to see it myself.
2 weeks after the Sparks assassination, John Gotti walked into the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy and declared himself the new boss of the Gambino family. There was no formal vote, no commission approval. He simply assumed the position with the confidence of a man who had already eliminated the only obstacle. The Ravenite became his court. Men came to pay their respects. The message was clear. The family had a new direction, a new temperament, and a new set of priorities. The era of the quiet businessman was over. John Gotti wanted the world to know who he was, and the world obliged. Within 2 years of the Sparks assassination, John Gotti had become something unprecedented in American organized crime. A celebrity. He appeared on the covers of magazines. News cameras followed him to court. When he walked out of federal trials, acquitted 3 separate times between 1984 and 1987, the crowds outside cheered. The press called him the Dapper Don, then the Teflon Don. And Gotti loved it. Gravano did not. Every camera shot outside the Ravenite was an FBI asset. Every newspaper profile was a roadmap. Every acquittal that Gotti celebrated publicly told the federal government exactly how hard they needed to work to put him away permanently. Gravano raised it with him more than once.
John, the cameras. Every day there's cameras out there. We're giving them everything.
Let them watch. You think they got anything? They got nothing.
But the FBI was already listening to more than Gotti knew. In 1986, John Gotti formally elevated Salvatore Gravano to the position of underboss of the Gambino crime family. The number 2 position, the operational commander. In practical terms, this meant Gravano ran the day-to-day business of the largest criminal organization in the United States. He managed the capos. He arbitrated disputes. He collected tribute, approved contracts, settled debts, and authorized violence. He was 39 years old, and he was, by any legitimate measure of power within that world, one of the most dangerous men in America. At trial, under direct examination, Salvatore Gravano admitted to participating in 19 murders. 19. Not all of them were his hands on the trigger. Some were orders he gave. Some were logistics he arranged. Some were killings he approved before being asked. But all 19 were, by his own sworn testimony, his responsibility. The prosecutor did not read the names all at once. The names came out over 9 days of testimony, one by one, each attached to a location, a method, a reason, and a relationship. This is what the list looked like. Not as numbers, as people. The first name was Joe Colucci. 1964. Gravano was 19 years old. Colucci had made enemies in the neighborhood. Someone with authority over Gravano decided the problem should be resolved permanently. Gravano was chosen to resolve it. This was not, in the world Gravano inhabited, an aberration. It was an audition. And he passed. What is notable, looking back, is not the act itself. It is what came after. Gravano did not fall apart. He did not become erratic. He did not drink himself into confession or confide in anyone. He went back to work. That quality, the ability to compartmentalize violence as simply another professional task, is what made him valuable, and what made him, over the following 30 years, extraordinarily dangerous. Robert Di Bernardo was a Gambino capo who controlled a substantial pornography distribution operation and had significant influence among the family's rank and file. In 1986, word reached Gotti that Di Bernardo was undermining him, speaking critically of the new administration, questioning decisions, creating quiet opposition. Gotti's response was immediate. He told Gravano to handle it. According to Gravano's trial testimony, Di Bernardo was lured to a location in Brooklyn on the pretense of a meeting. He was shot in the back of the head. His body was dismembered and disposed of in multiple locations. It was never recovered. Gotti was learning that Gravano would do what he was told, without debate, without conditions, and without aftermath. That discovery would later cost both of them everything. In 1988, Gotti told Gravano to kill Louis Melito. Louis Melito was not a problem associate or a rival. He was Gravano's friend, a man he had worked alongside for years, a man whose family knew Gravano's family. Gotti believed Melito was talking, that he had become a liability. The evidence, as Gravano would later describe it, was thin. But Gotti was not asking for a debate.
Louis is a problem. He talks too much. It needs to be handled.
You're sure about this? Louis's been solid.
I'm sure. You handle it, or I start wondering about you too.
Gravano handled it. Melito was called to a meeting. He came without suspicion because the call came from Sammy. His body was never found. His wife, Linda Melito, later wrote a book about what it meant to be married to a man who could disappear because his best friend decided to follow an order. That book is called Mafia Wife. Louis Di Bono was a Gambino associate who ran construction operations. He owed money. He had missed meetings, multiple meetings with Gotti himself, which was an offense that Gotti took as a personal insult. The order came down in 1990. Di Bono was found dead in his parked car in the basement parking garage of the World Trade Center in New York City. 3 bullets to the back of the head. He had been sitting in his car, apparently waiting for someone who arrived not for a meeting but for an execution. This killing was among those specifically detailed in the federal indictment that would be handed down weeks later. It was, for all practical purposes, the last murder of the Gotti era. The net had been closing for months. Neither Gotti nor Gravano knew it had already landed. 19. Gravano testified to 19 murders over the course of his criminal career. The question that prosecutors did not ask, because it was not their job to ask, was what carrying that number did to a man over time. Gravano himself addressed it in later interviews. In Peter Maas's biography, and in his own podcast years after his release, he described the killings not with remorse but with a kind of detached acknowledgement. He believed, or said he believed, that the men who died had largely operated in a world where that risk was understood. He made an exception for one, Louis Melito, the friend he killed because Gotti told him to. Whether that distinction matters is a question that belongs to the families of the other 18. While the killings were accumulating, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was assembling something that would outlast every single one of them. A case. FBI agent Bruce Mao led the Gambino squad. He had been building the investigation for years. Surveillance photographs, financial records, informant testimony from lower-level associates. What Mao needed was something that could penetrate the inner circle. What he got, eventually, was better than anything he had designed. He got the Ravenite apartment, and in that apartment, John Gotti gave the government everything it needed to bury him, entirely by himself. In 1990, FBI technicians installed a listening device in a private apartment above the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street. The apartment belonged to the widow of a former Gambino associate. Gotti had been using it for sensitive conversations, meetings he believed were too private to have in the club itself, where he suspected surveillance. He was right to suspect surveillance. He was wrong to believe the apartment was safe. The device captured audio from conversations conducted in the apartment over a period of months. What it captured was extraordinary, not because it revealed things the FBI didn't know, but because the voice on the tapes was John Gotti's. And John Gotti, in those private conversations, was not performing for cameras. He was being exactly who he was. The Ravenite tapes contained discussions of murders, financial arrangements, internal family politics, and strategic decisions made at the highest level of the Gambino organization. They also contained something the prosecution would use to devastating effect. Gotti talking about Gravano. Not with loyalty, not with respect, with blame. In multiple recorded conversations, Gotti attributed organizational problems to Gravano, questioned his judgment, expressed frustration with him, positioned him in the internal narrative Gotti was constructing as the source of difficulties that the boss himself had no responsibility for. The FBI noted this carefully, because if the tapes were ever played in a cell where Gravano could hear them, the prosecution would not need to convince him of anything. Gotti would do that himself. December 11, 1990. FBI agents moved simultaneously on multiple locations. John Gotti was arrested at the Ravenite Social Club. Salvatore Gravano was arrested nearby. Consigliere Frank Locascio was arrested as well. The charges were federal, RICO statute, racketeering, conspiracy, murder. For Gotti, the arrest was, publicly at least, another performance. He walked to the waiting federal vehicle with his chin up and his suit straight. For Gravano, it was something different. It was the moment he began calculating. Gravano was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan. His attorney brought him transcripts of the Ravenite tapes, then played the recordings themselves. Gravano listened to John Gotti's voice. the voice of the boss he had served, the man for whom he had committed murders, the man whose empire he had helped build, describing him as the source of the family's problems. Not as a partner, not as a loyalist, as a liability. According to documented accounts and Gravano's own later statements, he listened to the tapes without visible reaction. Then he set the transcripts down and asked his lawyer a single question.
What's the government offering if I cooperate?
What followed was not an impulsive decision. It was a precise, methodical assessment of available options conducted by a man who had spent 30 years surviving through exactly that kind of thinking. Option 1. Go to trial alongside Gotti. The tapes existed. The witnesses existed. The financial records existed. The probability of acquittal was, in Gravano's own assessment, close to zero. The likely outcome: life in federal prison. Option 2. Cooperate. He had 19 murders to account for. No prosecutor was going to offer him immunity. But cooperation would mean a sentence that had a number attached to it, a number with an end. And he had something the government wanted badly enough to trade for. He had everything, every murder, every conversation, every name, every structure of the family he had helped run for decades. He had John Gotti, and the government wanted John Gotti more than they had ever wanted anyone. In the fall of 1991, Salvatore Gravano entered into a cooperation agreement with the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York. The terms were, by any standard measurement, remarkable. Gravano would plead guilty to a single count of racketeering, an umbrella charge that encompassed his participation in 19 murders. He would provide complete and truthful testimony in all cases where the government called him as a witness. In exchange, he would receive a sentence recommendation that was left to the discretion of the judge, but which the government agreed to cap. The actual sentence Gravano received was 5 years. For 19 murders, 5 years. The reaction from the families of his victims when the sentence was announced was not recorded in the court transcript, but it was documented in the newspapers the following morning. April 2, 1992, Salvatore Gravano was sworn in as a witness for the United States government in the trial of United States versus John Gotti. The courtroom at the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. Gotti sat at the defense table in a suit that had been pressed that morning. The prosecutor was John Gleason, a meticulous and methodical assistant United States attorney who had been preparing for this moment for years. Gleason began simply. He asked Gravano to state his name.
Salvatore Gravano.
He asked Gravano what he did for a living.
I was the underboss of the Gambino crime family.
He asked how many people Gravano had been involved in killing. Gravano looked at the jury.
19.
The courtroom did not react audibly, but the silence that followed that word was, by every account of those present, absolute. Over the next 9 days, Salvatore Gravano testified in detail about the internal structure and operations of the Gambino crime family. He described the induction ceremony, the oath, the hierarchy, the tribute system, the decision-making process for violence. He described the Sparks assassination, where he was, what he saw, what happened in the hours before and after. He named names. He produced documents that corroborated his testimony. And through all of it, he was consistent. Cross-examination did not break him. Contradictions did not surface. He simply answered the questions as they came. with the calm of a man who had decided that the only thing left worth doing was telling the complete truth. Albert Krieger, Gotti's defense attorney, was one of the most experienced criminal lawyers in the country. He understood that he could not disprove Gravano's testimony. The corroborating evidence was too strong. So he attacked the witness.
You killed 19 people, and you're asking this jury to believe you.
Gravano looked at him without expression.
I'm not asking them to believe me because I'm a good man. I'm asking them to believe me because what I'm saying is true, and it matches everything else they've already seen.
Krieger did not have a follow-up that landed. June 23, 1992. The jury returned after 13 hours of deliberation. John Gotti was found guilty on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy, 5 murders, obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced him to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Gotti was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, and later to the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, where he died of throat cancer on June 10, 2002. He never cooperated with the government. He never publicly acknowledged what Gravano's testimony had done to him. He never spoke to Salvatore Gravano again. Salvatore Gravano received his sentence on September 26, 1994. 5 years. He had already served nearly 4 years in pretrial detention and protective custody, which meant he walked out of federal custody in 1995, having served for 19 murders and decades of organized crime, less time than many people serve for a first offense drug conviction. The reaction was immediate and lasting. Families of victims condemned the deal publicly. Legal scholars debated whether the precedent it set was worth the outcome. Law enforcement officials defended it on the grounds that it had broken the back of the most powerful criminal organization in the country. The government's position stated plainly: Gravano gave them Gotti, and Gotti was worth the price. Whether that accounting was just depends entirely on which side of the ledger you were on. In 1995, Salvatore Gravano entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. He was given a new name, new documents, a new history. He became James Moran. The government relocated him to the Phoenix, Arizona metropolitan area. They provided a financial stipend. They set him up with the tools to build a legitimate life. Gravano started a construction business. He had, after all, spent 30 years in the construction industry. He knew it better than almost anyone. He kept a low profile. He avoided contact with his former associates. He played the role of an ordinary businessman in an ordinary suburb. For approximately 2 years, this worked. Then it stopped working. The Witness Protection Program is designed to hide people. It is not designed to transform them. Salvatore Gravano had spent his entire adult life operating within a structure that provided clear hierarchy, clear purpose, clear rules, and a constant stream of decisions that required his specific skills. Suburbia provided none of those things. He was 50 years old. He was healthy. He was, by his own account in subsequent interviews, profoundly restless. The construction business was real but small. The neighbors were pleasant but irrelevant. The days were quiet in a way that a man who had run the underboss operation of the Gambino crime family found genuinely difficult to tolerate. He began spending more time with his son, Gerard. Gerard was not living quietly. Gerard Gravano had begun dealing ecstasy in the Phoenix area in the mid-1990s. Small quantities at first, local distribution through nightclub connections. Salvatore Gravano became aware of this. According to federal court records from the subsequent prosecution, rather than stopping his son, he became involved. His involvement was not peripheral. By 1997, Gravano was operating a wholesale ecstasy distribution network that was moving thousands of pills per week throughout the Phoenix and Tempe areas. He used a construction company called Marathon as a legitimate front. He organized the distribution through a loosely affiliated group of younger men who became known to law enforcement as the Devil's Advocates. The parallel was not lost on the federal agents building the Arizona case. The man who had been brought down in New York by FBI surveillance of his meetings was now being surveilled by the DEA in Arizona. The man who had testified about how the Gambino family used legitimate businesses as fronts was now running a legitimate business as a front. The man who had described in clinical detail how organized crime recruited young men and gave them structure and income was now doing exactly that in the suburbs of Phoenix. The agents documented his meetings, his phone calls, his financial transactions. They built the case the same way the FBI had built the Ravenite case, patiently, methodically, until there was nothing left to argue. February 24, 2000. Federal and state law enforcement officers executed simultaneous search warrants at multiple locations connected to Gravano's Arizona operation. At Gravano's residence in Tempe, they found ecstasy pills, cash, and records documenting the distribution network. Salvatore Gravano was arrested for the second time in his life. This time, there was no cooperation card to play. He had already used it. He had no John Gotti to trade. He had no organizational intelligence that the government didn't already possess. He had nothing. His lawyer entered a defense based on entrapment. He argued that law enforcement had manipulated Gravano into resuming criminal activity. The jury deliberated and rejected the argument. In 2002, Salvatore Gravano was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He was 57 years old when he was sentenced. He would be in his mid-70s when he was released. The government that had given him 5 years for 19 murders now gave him 20 years for running a drug operation that had not killed anyone. The families of his 19 victims did not find this ironic. They found it insufficient, and they said so publicly at every opportunity. Salvatore Gravano was released from federal custody in September of 2017. He was 72 years old. He was placed on supervised release. He returned to Arizona, and then he did something that no one who had known him during his Gambino years would have predicted. He became a media figure. He launched a podcast called Our Thing. He gave long-form interviews. He spoke at length about his life, his decisions, the murders, the testimony, the deal, and the years that followed. He was not, in any of these appearances, contrite. He was explanatory. He was argumentative. He was, in a way that was both compelling and deeply uncomfortable to watch, completely certain that his choices had been rational. In one documented interview, he said directly,
I didn't betray anybody. Gotti betrayed me first, on tape, in his own voice. You want to call me a rat, go ahead, but look at what I was responding to.
The families of the men Gravano killed did not share his framework. Linda Melito, whose husband Louis Gravano killed on Gotti's order in 1988, wrote about the experience of that loss in her memoir, Mafia Wife. She did not distinguish between the man who gave the order and the man who pulled the trigger. Other families made public statements over the years. Some spoke to journalists. Some appeared in documentary projects. Their position, expressed in various forms across various platforms, was consistent. Salvatore Gravano killed their family members. He served 5 years. He was then released, resumed criminal activity, was caught, was convicted again, and after serving that sentence, returned to public life to tell his story on his own terms. Whatever the government's calculation had been, the cost of that calculation had been paid not by the state. It had been paid by them. Today, Salvatore Gravano is in his late 70s. He lives in Arizona on supervised release conditions that restrict his activities and associations. He continues to speak publicly about his life. The record shows the following. He was a man of genuine organizational ability, who rose to the second highest position in the most powerful criminal organization in America. He killed 19 people over the course of his career, by his own sworn testimony. He provided cooperation that resulted in the conviction of John Gotti, and by federal prosecutors' accounts, contributed to the disruption of multiple mafia families across the country. He received 5 years for the murders. He then returned to organized crime in a different city with a different product. He received 20 years for that. He served the sentences. And he came out the other side still arguing that his choices were defensible. The government built its greatest organized crime prosecution on the testimony of a man who had committed 19 murders. That prosecution worked. John Gotti died in prison. The Gambino family lost its grip on New York, and Salvatore Gravano walked out of federal custody twice and told his story to anyone who would listen. The mafia's code said loyalty was everything. Gravano's life said loyalty was a variable, something you calculated, weighed, and discarded when the number on the other side of the equation was large enough. He wasn't wrong about Gotti. Gotti had already broken faith. The tapes proved it. But the 19 men whose names appeared in that federal indictment had not broken faith with anyone. They had simply been in the way. The file remains open. The questions remain unanswered.